And so in terms of White's legacy as a writer to other writers, where has it moved to, where the legacy remains, but in fact it's so fundamentally shifted into another world that it remains, I suppose, to contemporary taste?
Oh, well, no, I don't think it's closed to contemporary taste at all, because the shift from The Eye of the Storm to what I think is I actually think is his masterpiece, which is The Twyborn Affair, which he wrote as an old man, where the clarity of the writing is astonishing. It is still, of course, it's still pretty baroque, and it's very, very heavily written, but it is a great novel. And you don't need any introductions or primers. You don't need to immerse yourself in the thinking of another age to walk right into The Twyborn Affair. And I also think that's true of others of his novels, and they will survive on their own terms as you know, you can enter them. You don't need introductions to his work. Read the books. And if you find yourself in a landscape that welcomes you, stay there. But it's not closed. It's not written in another language. We're not asking people to learn German or something. This is magnificent English prose.
Kerry, can I read to you something that you said on the radio, and which is just so exquisite and spot on, and I'd like it to be an introduction to talking about some of the theatre writing. Kerry says, beauty and ugliness, moments of shame, moments of grace. These things are around us all the time, but it takes an artist to force us to see them. Without artists like Patrick White, life easily becomes grey. He's someone who makes us see the technicolor in the everyday. He achieves writing's minor miracle. Using nothing but words, he shakes us awake. Which I think is marvellously written, Kerry.
I said that 20 years ago on radio. I had no recollection of saying it until Stephen actually found it today and told it to me. So, but yes, I think that my opinion hasn't changed. When people say, if I'd had $1 for every time somebody had approached me rather aggressively and said, I read 10 pages of Voss, didn't understand a word of it, threw it away, what's that all about? You know? And I'd say, well, you should try finishing the book before you actually know what, before you want to know what it's all about. No, but anyway. And I was thinking with the plays, we did a production of a play which he wrote specifically for this group of 13 actors in Adelaide in 1983 called Netherwood. And it was Patrick's response to the threat of nuclear holocaust, among other things. And because of the timing of the school holidays, we were asked to do a school's matinee very soon after we'd opened, and we were all working. You know, we were back to backing. We were rehearsing one play in the daytime and performing another at night. And we felt that the management had slightly got this wrong, because the material was dense. It was a lot of sexual references, and you think Adelaide school kids, high school kids, 16, putting this, and they were going to be hooting and throwing things and shouting. Well, how wrong we were. They laughed in all the right places. They listened with such incredible attentiveness. They were moved by it, and at the end, the quality and the calibre of the incisiveness of the questions that they asked, and we thought, my gosh, how wrong. We had totally underestimated those kids. We had basically, as a group of adults, patronised them by thinking that they couldn't get it, but also seriously underestimating Patrick's ability just to speak to people. And I mean, I'm sure there were kids in that audience that didn't get it, but I would say that probably 90% of them did. And I thought, the plays are not difficult if you go in not expecting a linear progression. I mean, Patrick was a modern, and for people who have only seen naturalism in the theatre, and many people only have, because he was an expressionist writer, people are concerned by it. But if you just go in with an open mind, in the same way as that you go into an art gallery and look at a painting, That's what it was such a salutary experience, that school's matinee of Netherwood.
It seemed to me that when I was researching just Patrick White generally, the reception to his work was often qualified by institutional either publishers, reviewers, the intermediaries between us and the artists, constantly saying reader beware, qualifying their, however enthusiastic they were, that it couldn't possibly be successful, that the Twyburn affair was not for the squeamish. I thought that was an extraordinary thing to say. The Night the Prowler, when it was first screened in 1978...
1779, I think.
79?
78, that's right, yeah.
Was sort of screen tested in midnight screenings in downbeat cinemas because they needed to check that it was going to be okay. Were you aware of that? It's on the Film Archive kind of website. This constant kind of standing between us and our own discernment, our own taste. In fact, our own capacity to actually engage.
But that says at least as much about Australia at that time as it does about White. And because White was a huge figure in Australian literature, there was a lot of effort to try to corral him by those the moral forces who wanted to keep literature polite in this country. Literature was, like film and other things as well, a battleground.
Uplifting.
For respectability and for decency and that kind of thing. Now, what these idiots who are with us still, what these idiots didn't realise about White is that he was the most powerful spruiker for morality that anybody was going to read in an Australian work. I mean, this is the thing about White. What makes him extraordinary and makes him, for many people, uncongenial is that his work is not about finding happiness in the usual ways that are celebrated in literature. You don't find happiness in Patrick White's works through sexual fulfilment. You do not fall in love. The conclusion, you can fall in love, but the conclusion of one of White's novels is never that the lovers get together. That fundamental pattern of a novel is not White's. His novels and his work in theatre is warning people against easy pleasure. It's warning them against the pleasures of drink and food and sex and laziness and relaxation. It's warning them against the dangers of living in this country. And it is telling people that the point of living is to work and to work with what God has given you as your talents. And the greatest failures in his work and the greatest the people he fucked off in his life, viciously at times, were all the people he believed had failed their own talent and had not lived up to the promise that was in them at birth. And here were these petty little would-be moral tyrants whinging about this man whose greatest message about this country in the end was that we are an unprincipled people. And that's, for me, why White remains a strong force in this country. I would wish him to be a stronger force in this country, and a voice that still speaks here. We are an unprincipled country. It is time we found our principles.
Tell us about his identification as a Londoner. It was the very first thing he said when he was awarded the Nobel Prize. When he was asked about being an Australian, actually, he said, well, actually, I'm a Londoner. And David recently gave a lecture, the Menzies lecture, where you explore this theme in Patrick White, and there are a number of things that came out of it that I thought were absolutely fascinating. Would you like to just briefly survey? in a couple of minutes.
Well, I could first say that it's a bloody difficult assignment bringing Patrick White and Robert Menzies together into a coherent lecture. And I just, thank God I remembered that Menzies was present when White won the Miles Franklin Award for Voss, which was the first award of the Miles Franklin, and gave this completely ridiculous speech praising Patrick White, clearly not having read the book, because it said something like, it's marvellous that Australian literature is finally concentrating more on character than landscape, and you think, you have not read this book.
No.
It was at a time when White still voted for Menzies. And really that was, about it for the connection between the two. But what they also had in common was that they both adored England, but in completely different ways. Menzies adored England for its Englishness, for the monarchy. He wept when he saw the White Cliffs of Dover for the first time when he was in his 40s. He was in his 40s before he saw England for the first time. Whereas White had been born there, he'd gone to university there, as Stephen said, he'd gone to school there, and when it came to being a writer, the place he wanted to do that was in London, and what he wanted to be at that time was to be the next great West End playwright. And he lived in London for long stretches, and he was Patrick, to the end of his days, was the kind of person who adored London by whinging about it ceaselessly. You can show your love of this city by ceaselessly moaning about Melbourne, but it's actually love that you're expressing. We're familiar with it in Sydney as well. But London was enormously important to him. And when you go through the novels, he wrote his first, Happy Valley, in London. He wrote the second one, partly in London, partly in New York, about London. Voss, the idea for Voss came to him during the Blitz, as he was upending a bottle of Calvados into his gullet as the bombs were coming down, and reading the journals of air, and being suddenly thinking, I've got to write a novel about an explorer. The idea of the aunt's story was all conceived in London, and thereafter, when there was a long hiatus, when he went to Australia, he saw that land of emptiness that he saw as Australia then, while all of those other artists were fleeing to New York and fleeing to London, he came back. And that was the point. He could say all of those terrible things about this country because he came back to write about it. And that was the bravest thing he ever did in his life. So while he claimed to be a Londoner at heart, and in many, many ways he was an artist. And this is where he knew he had to be, as an artist. But he never wanted anybody to own him. And so in 1973, when he won the Nobel Prize, which pleased him enormously, do not believe any other, but pleased him enormously, the interviews he gave immediately after winning the Nobel Prize, he asserted his independence by saying, "You don't own me. I'm a funny kind of Australian. I'm actually a Londoner at heart." And he believed that, and in part it was sort of true. But London was essential, certainly later in life, to publishing. He'd always had a great New York publisher. He finally found a great London publisher, and in those days you had to be, for his kind of writer, published first in either New York or London. And London was where he found such wonderful stories. The gossip from London was just simply the best gossip in the world.
And the meeting with Roy de Maistre.
And in London, he had discovered an Australian, Roy de Maistre, a painter, and it was Roy who was this strange man who went quite bananas towards the end of his life and concocted a close royal connection and became a Catholic and painted rather good Stations of the Cross, which hangs in Westminster Cathedral, and did some terrific religious painting, actually. But Roy plucked up young men and made them see the possibilities of their own talent. And before he plucked up young Patrick White and said, look, mate, you're not really the next Galsworthy, you're actually a novelist and get on with it and take your inspiration from Australia, he'd taken this furniture designer, Francis Bacon, and said, look, you're not really a furniture designer, I think you might be a painter. And that was a great gift that Demesta had, of finding this talent. It was all mixed up with all kinds of sexual mentoring as well, but it was crucial for White. And of course, to have been in London when the Blitz began was, in imaginative terms, one of the fundamental experiences of White's life. And the Blitz and the rain of fire from the sky is an image that recurs throughout his work from the time he himself was caught in the Blitz. And finally it's there in the finale of the Twyborn affair, and Eddie Twyborn, having not taken off his makeup, but having taken off his frock at least and put on a pair of pants, is crossing London to be reunited with his mother and is killed in the Blitz. And the fire from the sky is a fundamental image of White's, all from London.
And the punchline of your lecture, which I really did enjoy, if you believe that Sir Robert needed to be redeemed at all, is that he did not. He advised the Liberal Party not to block supply in 1975.
I was desperately searching for one more thing they had in common, and the opinion that supply should not have been blocked in 1975.
I think that's Marr.
Yes, was a desperate attempt to find something at the end.
We can keep talking, but just in the event that actually there are questions, feel free to raise your hand. There are roving mics. You can direct your question to anyone in particular, or it can be general. We do have a question down here if we have a person.
Thank you. Could I ask...
Half a tick, there's a roving mic coming.
I can.
Thank you. Ian Mence is my name. Could I ask about Geoffrey Dutton? White's relationship with Dutton was ambivalent and exploded at the end when Dutton's wife suicided, as I understand, in the late-night phone call.
Oh, you've conflated actually two terrible fuck-offs in White's life. It was Nolan's wife who suicided. Geoffrey Dutton's wife lived to a very ripe old age and died quietly in the Blue Mountains a few years ago. But Geoffrey Dutton was like a son to White. He was beautiful, he was talented, he was from the right class. All things that mattered a lot to Patrick. And it was for Geoffrey Dutton that he wrote that essay which Stephen was talking about, one of the greatest essays written in this country, where we talk about the buttocks of cars become hourly glacier and various other things. That was all for Geoffrey Dutton. But Dutton did not, in White's view, live up to his own talent, and the early books were not followed by equally thoughtful books, and Dutton became a kind of literary journalist of a very high order, but of a literary journalist in order to survive. And
he accepted some money from Nobel Oil, didn't he?
He wrote the text for a book of very, very beautiful photographs of Australia, which was published by Nobel Oil. And that wasn't quite it. Remember, he wrote something for the Bulletin where he described Patrick White as coming from Australian aristocracy.
That's right. Yes.
Remember that?
Yes,
and that was the utter, final, last straw. Yeah. Oh, and he also left his wife, which was another mark against him. Yes. Mm.
This is to David. This is just a little bit of gossip. When White was in Alexandria, did he meet E.M. Forster?
No, they were never there at the same time at all. At completely different periods. I mean, Forster was there just after the First World War. Patrick was there after the Second.
Okay.
Yeah. But Manoli, when he was working in his uncle's bank, did meet Caffafi. And Caffafi was pointed out to the young Manoli Lascaris to be careful of the customer who comes in that shabby raincoat, because that's that poet Caffafi.
I thought there was something,
wow.
Because I was in Alexandria about 18 months ago and I went to Caffafi's house and that's why.
Yeah, no, it's the connection with the very, very minor connection with Covfefe is through Manoli, and you'll be pleased to know that both of them took a rather snooty view of Covfefe. They thought he was not the great poet; it was Zephyrus who was the great poet. It just gets more and more complicated.
My name is Lisa Hill from ANZ Lit Lovers. My question is for David Musgrave. I love Patrick White, so I was ecstatic when I discovered Glissando. And I dug out my Voss and I read that again, and I read yours and I read that again, and so it's absolutely wonderful. I want to know, though, where the idea of the architecture in the outback, the grand house in the outback, is that something from Patrick White, or White that I have yet to discover?
No, it's not from Patrick White. It's more of a family thing. One of my forebears was a colonial architect, and there was always that interest in the family with architecture, and that was the initial impetus. And the other impetus was meditation on the arts in general. Because there's a kind of a strong current of German romanticism, or a version of it, or a take on it running through Voss. I thought that part of that idea is the unity and the organic unity of the arts, and so I was trying to play with that idea, particularly with music and architecture.
Who was the architect, David?
Edmund Blackett.
Oh, that's okay for an ancestor. That's just fine.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. We don't have a question, and we're right. Oh, we do. We have two, in fact.
Mine's more a thank you to David for writing his book. My mother was a great fan of Patrick White, and she died just before Christmas. And she was a little bit lonely in her later years because she couldn't find anyone to talk to about Patrick White. And she read all his books, and she waited for each one to be published. And she was born in the same year as him. So if he was alive now, he'd be 98 or 99. And in her last weeks, I realised I wouldn't have time. She was blind, so I was reading her something, and I didn't have time to read a novel. I thought, which of the novels could I read? It's all a bit dense, really, to read when someone's in their last weeks. But I read the letters, and it was as if over those weeks we were reading her the letters. Everyone who came was reading her one of the letters. It was as if they were letters to her. So she knew all the people, Nolan and Peggy, and all the names and all the people. And you said that Australia hasn't changed a bit, but I think it changed because of Patrick White and that sort of coterie of people like my mother who were quietly reading the books. Actually,
it changed a lot.
I think that's beautifully said.
Oh, how lovely! That's gorgeous.
Yes.
How wonderful. And if there's a last task to be done for Patrick White, and I don't know who's going to do it because I can't actually see myself doing it, which is to index the totality of his letters everywhere where they are. So if you want to know what Patrick White thought of Henry Handel Richardson, here are the letters to go to where you can find out what he thought about Henry Handel Richardson, because Patrick was a great spectator of Australia, and particularly after he came up from Castle Hill into Centennial Park, and he was writing these letters about what was happening in Australia, what he saw. He's a great spectator. And though there are hundreds of letters in the book of letters that I did, there are now thousands of letters in public collections, and they are full of shrewd, small, sometimes long reflections on what's happening in Australia around him. And I have this notion of a computerised index where you can find what you want. I mean, if you want to know, did Patrick meet Stravinsky when he came on his last tour of Australia to conduct? Yes. And it's one of the little things in Patrick's letters that I love most, of him having dinner with Stravinsky and how tiny Stravinsky was, and Patrick's observation that Stravinsky's wife was enormous, and he thought of Stravinsky's wife as rather like a St Bernard dog, and he wondered whether she took him around the house in her teeth, and Stravinsky saying to him, "I'm a drunk, I'm a professional drunk, all the time I drink whiskey," and Patrick observing that he held it very well, and then at the end of the meal he handed me some walnuts, very soft palms, many rings. It's just breathtaking. It's just breathtaking. And these letters, his letters go back, right into the 30s, of sort of theatrical London, all the way to the 1980s when he's raging about politics in Australia. And if there is somebody out there who would like to spend a couple of years learning how to read his handwriting first and then just indexing those wonderful letters, because there's so much more. I'm so pleased to hear that you read them to her. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can leave us with one thought. Patrick White was delirious when he read in Pushkin's own non-fiction that Pushkin regarded writing as shitting, that it was something that you had to get out of yourself. And I think, could we all just put our hands together to say, Mr. White, thank you so much for relieving yourself. David, Kerry and David, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming to the Wheeler Centre.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.